George. I'm not sure what was making it scream crazy, but good evening. Good evening. It's Friday, so maybe it's a different vibe. We're in a little bit of a corner response. When I say oli, 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 you say oi, oi, oi. Oli, oli, oli. Oli, oli, oli. Okay, I knew that would get your attention. And it's a good place. It's a privilege to be here. I think it's a bit ironic actually because got rejected from Cambridge probably about 10 years ago. So some would say the organisers are trying to add a salt to the ring, or someone else might say it's a full circle moment. I don't know. You take it for what it is. I think I'll take the latter. But for me, on this process, I think Cambridge is one of the upper echelon when it kind of comes to learning, right? And for me, my learning experience has been very different. It's been more focused on the grassroots. And as a humanitarian engineer, my whole kind of focus was on fixing bikes, one of the best places in the country. Don't know if anyone can guess. Anyone know? No? Peckham? And, when I was growing up there, now it's known for rooftop bars, it's known for all of these interesting things. When I was growing up in that environment, it was very much about deprivation, it was around poverty, it was a situation where at 14 years old, my brother was falsely in prison for murder, and over 6 other charges. And it was very easy to become a product of your environment in that state. But for me, at that point, I kind of said to myself, I was literally and metaphorically growing up in the weeds, right? And in a lot of ways, as you're kind of navigating those weeds, I was fixing my bikes, literally was stinging them. My mum would tell you, taking out the stinging nettle from the ground. But that was the most transformative classroom I could have had. Right, and I was speaking with a friend very recently. He's building some technology in order to go into space, and he's planning on doing that next year. And I was kind of asking him more about it, for him to kind of show me what he's been working on. And he showed me a picture, and it was more of his lab and the equipment that he was using. This equipment that he was building, everything was in his bedroom. His bed was probably the smallest part of the thing in that picture. And I was like, this stuff can literally happen from anywhere. And this all happened before he secured venture capital funding to take the idea further. But that all started in his bedroom. And for many of us, we're often focused on the flowers in the story, right? So there's a lot of these stories of the rags to riches whereby you're seeing people starting from their bedrooms or starting, from a garage, for example. But because we always focus on what looks good for social media, what looks good for the highlights, we often forget the very genesis of where these people have started. And it's often at the grassroots, it's often in the weeds when, a lot of the magic essentially is happening. And for me, I'm a big believer that learning and ideas can come from anywhere. So it's not about necessarily choosing the best place to learn or the best environment to learn. It's more about how can you learn in all the environments you find yourself in. So it doesn't matter what institution you go to. It doesn't matter if I was rejected from there. Because wherever I go to, there's something I can learn that can still kind of keep you at the top of your game. And that's why I call that the motives mindset, and you learn in all environments. So any post that I do, whether it's on LinkedIn or on Instagram, you'll see me put #motives mindset, #the kid from Peckham. And the reason I do that is to show that, contrary to popular opinion, excellence can be found everywhere. And it looks like every single one of us, right? All actively devoted to our craft. So I think for me, there's a lot of places where you can kind of, be exposed to learning and learn. But I've often found it in a lot of unconventional environments. And one of the most unconventional ways that not many people spoke to me about was service. So today I'm going to speak to you about how learning and service are two sides of the same coin. So if we go into it, the best analogy I can give you is one of the toolbox. I'm an engineer, right? And when it comes to the toolbox, there's probably three main tools that have been most transformative for me in terms of teachers. And the first one, I would say, really started in my childhood. You wouldn't guess, as a spanner. Right? But the spanner for me taught me a lot of things. The first thing that it taught me, and I saw the owners in Peckham, that's where I actually first got exposed to the spanner and how to use it. But the first thing that it taught me was all around experimenting and learning. How do we actually, become more doers in the process? It taught me the second thing, which is around being a bias to action. So I learned through that process. I was more of a kinesthetic learner. I learned by doing. I learned through going through the process. And the more skin that you have in the game, the more you're invested to do more. It's a natural process. If you start buying one set of makeup, they end up finding you with more sets of makeup from the same brand. That's just how it goes, right? So I learned that that's also how I learned. That was accelerating my learning in the process. And kind of as I was going through all of that, one of the biggest things for me was all around, often in life, the biggest thing that you can learn from the spanner is that a lot of times things are going to fall apart. You're going to have to put them back together. Right? So for me and my journey, it started off with bikes. We went from 2 wheels to 4 wheels. I started go-karting. But adversity eventually comes along the way. That go-karting track, eventually they had insufficient funds, so they could no longer go on. Right? It's Peckham at the end of the day. It's not easy. So we were kind of going through that process. And I said, look, if I can't be inside of the car and race, I'll be outside of the car and work to build it. And that was my overall motivation as I was progressing. And that, eventually led me to studying engineering GCSE. So I chose that, which isn't a very common thing. But I chose that, and then eventually I built a product, my first product. It was all around sustainability, and I was in the top 1% in the country for that course. So I absolutely loved what I was doing. I was coming in on Saturdays. I was fully devoted, right? And the spanner essentially took me there. And the main thing that I learned is the importance of being experiential, actually being practical when you learn. Because sometimes that's when you're going to see the best, in you. And there's a lot of stats to show, you're almost 70% more likely to retain that information when you go through that experiential route compared to traditional learning. So it's a fact, it's known, right? So it's about how can we actually embrace that when we're thinking about the new Playbook for Learning. And for me, that spanner eventually took me on to a place where I'd done my GCSE and I was inspired now to do mechanical engineering program at UCL. That's essentially where I ended up. And at university, the second tool that was very useful for me was the hammer. And I say the hammer because the force of rejection was the biggest teacher I could have ever had, right? So whether that was rejection from Cambridge, as discussed, I thought that this was going to be a place where I was going to be the best student, I was going to smash it, I got this, you know what I mean? This didn't happen. Shout out to St. Cats. And then, I was kind of going through that, even in uni. My first year, my second year, I was doing Formula student. I thought, in third year, this is going to be my roadway to motorsport. Third year, I was rejected because I was fixing what? Bikes, not cars. So I didn't have that motorsport IQ. I didn't necessarily know how to navigate those environments. And then, even Rolls Royce, when I applied after getting rejected from Formula student, I was rejected there. And I reapplied, and then eventually saved them £50 million through redesigning one of their components in their jet engines. That's the same person that was rejected. And one thing that I learned from the grassroots was I was looking at components that many people at Rolls-Royce weren't looking at, because I realized that you should never neglect small beginnings or small components. So whilst everyone was focused on the sexy components, the turbine blades and everything else, I touched something that hadn't been touched for 40 years. And decided to focus on that, and that was the biggest opportunity. And now that component is in almost every single Rolls-Royce jet engine that you get on in and around the world. So that tool, I guess, taught me that rejection doesn't define you, right? It doesn't ever kind of show your intrinsic value. And the most important thing in that process is really understanding that the George that was rejected from the opportunity is the same George that is developing products and programs that are impacting people and communities all around the world, right? And, kind of going from that process of the hammer as I was starting to work on my craft. I got an email from a guy called Lewis Hamilton. Anyone know? You've heard of him before, right? I thought it was spam. And then eventually that email led me on to working with him as a junior engineer on his extremely electric racing team, and then performance engineer, where we won the world championship. But you won't believe it, 0.6 seconds. Very small margins. And then, I went on to being a race engineer, so responsible for most of the engineering duties on that race team. And for me, that was phenomenal because I nearly gave up on that motorsport dream when I got rejected, but I kind of kept on going through that process. And the key thing that I kind of learned in terms of a tool was what many people might call a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife. Anyone know a Swiss Army knife? Right? So I think the Swiss Army knife was the tool that came to mind and really one of the best things for learning, because I realized you have to be versatile. You have to be adaptable. That Swiss Army knife came about when people were trying to open tins and little cans for food, for example. But for me, I kind of realized that was going to be very important in my journey, because it's not just important to learn how to code to make me a better engineer. It's also important to learn emotional intelligence. It's also important to learn storytelling and communication. Like that stuff probably couldn't be up here today. Alright? So all of these things are super important because of all the different hats that I now wear. Whether that is a humanitarian engineer, a CEO, or a board member, all of these things require different things from me. Right? So whether it's at motives at the grassroots level, we're impacting thousands of young people every single year to help them go into STEM, and we're helping them explore those careers. Some of the most practical examples of the practical learning, which I touched on earlier, I would say is, has anyone heard of Big Money? Show of hands if you have. Yeah, Big Money, he does these science experiments essentially in his garden. So just like in the garden, showing people how cool a career in STEM can be or science can be. I've got my nieces, for example, they're always on Roblox. I see that as the future, right? It's very much, they're building their own futures. The third thing that I say is when we're working with our kids at the grassroots level, when we're trying to get them into motorsport, we don't speak to them about motorsport, we show them how to get into motorsport. So we bring the radio control cars that many of them would have wanted as kids, but probably couldn't afford, and show them how these actually work so they can get an understanding of what are the principles here and within motorsport. So that's at the grassroots level. But at the business level, I'm pushing the future technologies within motorsport that will hopefully impact all of you. When we look at the cars, for example, that you're going to buy, or whatever kind of vehicles you go for. This past year, I've spent it building an electric car from scratch in under a year to set a lap record at a track called the Nürburgring. Right? And that is essentially at the business level what I have to do. At a governance level, what I have to do is raise and distribute millions of pounds to support people and communities. And I get a chance to do that basically at the Co-op Foundation. And you can imagine this requires so many different skill sets from me. So as I conclude and wrap up, when I think about learning and rewriting and playbook of that, for me, the biggest thing I've learned about it is learning is so much bigger than you. What if I told you that you're merely a conduit in this whole process of learning? I think in this society that we're in, it's very self-absorbed. Of course, it's a capitalist society for the most part. So often when we think about learning, it's mostly about personal gain. How do I do this bachelor, this master, so that I can get 5K more, 10K more? It's all cool stuff. It's costly, because it is. I understand. You get what I mean? But for the most part, we need to be thinking beyond that. What if we thought about other people's needs? And then that allows you to think about what skills, what time, what resources you can actually give to these people to impact their lives. And one big thing that I've learned about service in general is it's a muscle. It's a learned behavior. It doesn't just come to you. But as you start to do it, you start to have a domino effect. You start to impact yourself, but also the communities around you. So as I close, I'm going to leave you with two quotes. The first one is from someone that actually came and lectured here before, Einstein, if you didn't know that. And that quote is, the highest privilege is being able to learn, and the highest purpose is being able to serve. And in the word, in the words of the greatest to ever live, literally called himself the greatest, Muhammad Ali, he said, service is the rent we pay for our time here on earth. And all of us know our landlord's rent is always due, right? So it's important that we pay today, so let's keep serving, the miracle continues.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I should have picked up. But yeah, I think it's amazing that you're encouraging people to take the route that best suits them to get to the places where they want to be and their futures. But I think it's a learned thing that usually when we take the unconventional route, sometimes it makes it a lot harder to exist in spaces once you get there. So our first question for you is, what would you say to a young engineer from a marginalized group who feels like they don't fit in conventional STEM areas?
That's a great question. That's exactly how I felt as I was kind of going through the process. And the biggest thing that built my confidence was me experimenting, me learning, me going through that process, because when I saw that I could do it, I could do exactly what they could do. By the time I applied for the course at university, I didn't think any of them was ahead of me when it came to the practical side. Don't get me wrong, some of them did further maths, they did all these subjects that I didn't do, right? But I knew when it came to doing projects, I was a cut above the rest. That's what I believe, that was my belief system. So I think it's super important. If you're an engineer, it's all about doing, it's all about being practical. So you have to start working on projects, because that's what builds your confidence. Because if not, it's all theory. And it's very difficult to know, kind of where you fit within that whole perspective. So yeah, I'd say do that and get people. So my engineering teacher at the time was my biggest inspiration, right? So he was technically my mentor at the time. Find people that believe in you more than hopefully you believe in yourself.
Amazing, thank you. I think that will apply to a lot of people who have ended up at Cambridge from backgrounds that don't usually come here and have felt their scheme. So it's really great advice. Thank you. How has your journey as an engineer for Formula One influenced your perspective on diversity in STEM fields?
It's a good question. So most recently, I was on the board of the Hamilton Commission, who essentially set up back in 2020 to investigate the barriers that young black people were facing going into STEM. Still kind of more specifically, and we kind of produced a lot of recommendations, and one of them was to actually develop a diversity and inclusion charter. So all of these 10 teams would be accountable to actually moving the dial and making sure that whether it's a figure in Clacton, Brixton, somewhere in places that I haven't really gone to, East Ham, wherever it might be, that has a geographical barrier, for example, to being in a place like Motorsport Valley, which doubles around Oxford and Northampton, they could get an opportunity, right? So the teams will actually reach out, because as I said in the talk, a lot of times the best talent is found in these unconventional places. So I'm very big on making sure that we drive that. So I've developed a lot of schemes to make sure that championships and different teams bring that together, and I work with some of the F1 teams to make that happen. So I think it's cliche, but you really have to be the change that you want to see. So as soon as I came into the championship, I said, by the time I leave, it needs to be better than I found it. And now, when I left the Extreme Championship in that way, I can tell you that it was so much better. The palette was so much more diverse, and that's what it's about.
No, that's amazing. And this is a follow-up. Do you feel like this TNI that is authentic and genuine, or do you feel like at times you fall into the space that people do it for the sake of image?
Yeah, I would say most people are doing it for the sake of image anyway, you know what I mean? Like, that is the general kind of consensus. Like, they all want to look good. Everyone wants to look good. We all want to put up a story that we've done something well, right? You know, so I think all of them want to show something like that. And there's some of them that, you know, they kind of understand the importance of doing that, to showcase it, to drive momentum and to make more change. And for those people, it's authentic. I would say it's still few and far between. So there's a lot of parts of the minds that you have to change if you're truly trying to move the needle. But that's why I think people like Lewis Hamilton are phenomenal in the motorsport context to be the icons, people that are driving change, that are winning races and showing that excellence and diversity go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you so much. And last but not least, what role do you think mentorship plays in empowering the next generation of engineers?
That's a great question. For me, mentoring has been the single biggest thing that has accelerated my journey. So you've got horizontal mentors, which, you know, sometimes your peers, maybe, you know, my business partner, for example, could have been a horizontal mentor. These are people that are similar levels, but, you know, maybe they know a particular area a bit more than your subject. They know it a little bit more than you, so you kind of go on there when you learn most of your things. So I would say that those are very important and probably learn the most from them. They influence you the most. So usually if I was trying to get certain grades, I would surround myself with people that are going and getting those grades and essentially mentoring me through the process. And then the practical mentors have been key in making sure that I go from level 1 to level 5. You know, they are in environments that I've never been in. So that's kind of how Lewis heard about me. It was through a mentor that brought me to a space that I otherwise wouldn't have been in. But because I was at that table, my name was, you know, in the ring, and eventually I can be chosen for a once in a lifetime opportunity that I would have never been able to get by myself. So I think that's why I talk about service today, because if it wasn't for him serving and saying, how can we bring more people into the room, I wouldn't be here speaking about the stories that I talk about today.
Amazing, and horizontal networking and like support is one of the most valuable things you can get. So thank you so much for that advice and your amazing speech. Thank you.